Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and our guest is attorney Lloyd Snook. The program today is The Incident. It's about August 12th and 11th at Charlottesville, Virginia. Before we go further, though, I'd like for our guests to give a little back to our audience. Counselor, could you give our audience a little background?
Sure. Well, first of all, about myself, I grew up in Charlottesville, went to public schools, graduated from Lane High School in 1970, go Black Knights, and then on to college and law school, then graduated from law school in 1979, and the day after graduation, got married to my now wife and my law partner, Sheila Hoy. And the firm is Snook & Hoy in downtown Charlottesville. We do a lot of criminal law, family law, juvenile court law, write some wills, settle a few estates, civil litigation of all sorts.
Okay, terrific.
38 years.
38 years. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, let's give us a little background about the incident of August the 12th. The City Council voted to move the statues of Robert Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And there's a lawsuit that was filed to prevent this from happening. What is that all about, and what is happening with that lawsuit?
Well, so in the 1920s, the early 1920s, during a time of a sort of a resurgence of Jim Crow, white supremacy, anti-black activity, particularly in the South, Paul Goodloe McIntyre, who gave us McIntyre Park and a number of other good things in Charlottesville, decided that he wanted to give to Charlottesville some parks that would include statues to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Confederate generals. And so that happened. And then about a year or two ago, a young woman who was a high school student at CHS, I believe it was, said, why do we have statues to Confederate generals when they lost the war and they were in favor of slavery, and why are we honoring these people? And so this became kind of a groundswell of a political movement that really all just started because of a question that was asked by one student at Charlottesville High School. And so council wound up deciding that they wanted to remove the statues. First they had a commission that was established to try to figure out what the best response would be. Should we move the statues? Should we add other statues that would give sort of the other side to some of this? The phrase is recontextualize. Should we recontextualize all of this to sort of put slavery, we can't wipe it off the history books, it happened, it's there, but what do we do about this? And so it was a big political issue. And ultimately, council decided to go ahead and remove the statues. Before they could do so, a lawsuit was filed. This was back in March. A lawsuit was filed in Charlottesville Circuit Court saying, no, you can't move the statues. There's a Virginia state law that says you can't move statues that commemorate with the war, or more accurately, that are statues to Civil War veterans. And it's not just Civil War, it's basically any wars. Mm-hmm. And so the question was, well, does this law apply to these statues? And can the city move them? And the judge has been trying to figure this out, has had his rulings. He sort of put a stay on everything and said, no, you can't move anything until we get this figured out. So it was with that in mind that a group decided first in July, a group of Ku Klux Klan members came and had a rally at what is now called Justice Park, used to be called Jackson Park, right next to the courthouse. Mm-hmm. And the KKK rally, there were probably 1,000 counter-protesters, but only about 40 KKK members showed up. Well, the right-wing folks, the alt-right, they would call themselves. Sometimes they also will admit that they are Nazis. They're running around giving Nazi salutes and have all kinds of Hitler references in what they're doing. The alt-right had decided to have the Unite the Right rally, they called it, and it was scheduled for August 12th. And so on August 12th, all these folks were coming in representing a lot of groups that are sort of white supremacist, The phrase is identitarian, white identitarian movements. These are groups who feel that white people are being discriminated against. These are people who feel that it is important that they fight back to preserve the white heritage of this country. And they were the ones who were coming together on August 12th. They actually came together first on August 11th. And August 11th was when they gathered down around the university in about 200 of them with tiki torches and the torchlight parade around the university. And it wound up around the statue of Thomas Jefferson that is in front of the rotunda, where about 20 students had gathered to surround the statue with carrying signs against white supremacy. And these folks came over with their tiki torches and basically attacked the students who were surrounding the statue. And some of those folks have been arrested, and some of those folks have been charged with crimes associated with the attacks. That was a very scary incident. There was, at St. Paul's Memorial Church, which is the church basically right across the street from there, there was a group of about 600 people in a prayer service that was specifically part of the anti-Unite the Right group. And this was a group of both black and white and ministers and private citizens and everybody else. And here, just 100 yards away, was where all of the Nazi folks with their tiki torches were. And it was a potentially very scary kind of a situation. I was there that night at the church. We were having to decide, okay, is it safe to let people go out the side door now? Because we didn't want anybody going out the front door into the area where the demonstration was going on with the torches. So that was scary, and that's part of the incident. That's the incident of August 11th. On the 12th, what happened was the rally was supposed to, the Unite the Right rally was supposed to start at noon. Well, everybody started gathering a whole lot earlier than noon. And by about 10:30, there were probably 400 or 500 anti-protesters, counter-protesters out in the middle of Market Street. This was all a protest that was going on around the Robert E. Lee statue in what was formerly called Lee Park, now called Emancipation Park. 400 or 500 at least, and the number grew over the course of the day, who were in Market Street protesting, shouting, hollering. Meanwhile, the Nazi folks were accumulating. They came into the park. There was a period of time for about a half an hour where people were yelling back and forth, where they were throwing things back and forth, water bottles. There were some bottles that were, Tom Perriello said he got hit with a bottle that apparently had some bleach or something in it because it kind of got into his eyes. He could tell that. There are reports that there were bottles of urine being thrown, that some of the bottles were frozen, so they were hard objects. A lot of reports about stuff being thrown back and forth. At one point, the right-wing folks were marching from one entrance to the park to another entrance to the park where they were supposed to be going in. As they did, they were marching just within feet of the counter-protesters, and that led to some scuffles and some fights. Ultimately, at about 11:30, the police declared an unlawful assembly, which means things have gotten out of hand. We want you all to go, to leave. And so all of the Unite the Right folks decided they would march down to McIntyre Park. Now, one thing I left out of the process was that a couple days before this, the city had said, okay, we've gotten a lot of reports about violence that you guys are planning. We don't want this to happen in downtown Charlottesville. We want this to happen at McIntyre Park, where, first of all, it's farther away from anybody who can get hurt. Second, it's a larger space. We can control it better. We can separate people better. And the Unite the Right people said, no, we want to be in Emancipation Park. And so they went to court, federal court. Judge Conrad decided about 8 o'clock on Friday night that the city had not proven its case, had not made out a case that would say that there's a danger to remaining downtown. Mm-hmm. And so the city's efforts to move everything to McIntyre Park were overruled, and so they got to go ahead with their rally in Lee Park. Emancipation Park. So that sort of set the stage. Ultimately, they go down to McIntyre Park. They do some of their rally thing there. They give a bunch of speeches there, and then they kind of break up. Meanwhile, there are groups of alt-right people who are marching around downtown Charlottesville, and some of these people are seemingly armed, some of them armed with bats, some of them armed with sticks, some of them with shields. Some of them had guns that you probably couldn't see, but we know in a couple of cases that guns were actually pulled out and fired. At one point, they went over to Friendship Court over on Garrett Street, and apparently were planning on marching through Friendship Court to just for no other purpose than to intimidate.
And this is a low-income housing.
This is a low-income housing project on Garrett Street, right in downtown Charlottesville. And the residents of Friendship Court apparently met them at the entrance and said, "You're not coming here."
Oh, good for them.
So as they were all marching around, and of course the counter-protesters were marching around also, and it was really kind of a chaotic scene in downtown Charlottesville for a few hours there. At about 12:15, I think it was, as a group was marching eastbound on Market Street in front of the parking garage on Market Street. There were a series of fights, and there have been some people charged and all of that. One person, DeAndre Harris, got chased into the parking garage, and there's some rather graphic video of people beating him with sticks and poles and things like that. There's also some video that seems to show DeAndre hitting somebody with a baseball bat or a small stick of some sort. It's not clear, as I look at the video, it's not clear whether that effort actually landed, whether it actually hit anybody.
Self-defense.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? Well, it came before the self-defense thing, but it's going to be a messy case to sort out, and that's what courts are for, and that's what juries are for, and they will get that all figured out some months down the road. In the meantime, about 1:40 p.m., a car driven by James Alex Fields, Jr. of Ohio, came roaring down 4th Street and slammed into a crowd of people that was gathered down at 4th and Water Street, and hit a lot of people, injured 19 or so, and apparently injured about 19 people, and killed Heather Heyer, a young woman who was, I don't know exactly whether she was run over or whether she was pinned between Fields' car and the car that he ran into, just what the mechanism was. Fields then threw the car into reverse, backed up at a really ferocious speed, and got away over to about Monticello Avenue before the police stopped him. So we have, coming out of August 12th, we have one death. We have, ultimately, we figured out about 35 or 40 injuries that resulted in trips to the hospital, some from the car crashing into the group, some from other things that happened that day. We've got lawsuits galore. We've got the injured people suing the people who injured them. We've got the injured people suing the leaders of the groups that all came. We've got lawsuits threatened against the city. We've got a lawsuit that has been brought challenging the private militias that were running around Charlottesville that day. We had different groups that were armed with semi-automatic rifles, that were in body armor, that were in helmets and shields and wearing camouflage. It looked for all the world to me like they were legitimate National Guard troops. And so one of the lawsuits is going to decide whether those kinds of private militias can walk around. A militia is fine in Virginia provided it's under the control of the governor. But these folks clearly weren't under the control of the governor.
Right.
So lawsuits galore, and when we talk about the incident as going forward, that's what we're dealing with.
Okay, so now here we are. Let's talk about the First Amendment right in regards to that incident on protecting free speech.
Well, the first thing that everybody needs to remember is that free speech includes the right to be offensive. It includes the right to say things that we would call hate speech, things that your mama would want to wash your mouth out with soap for saying. And so free speech is content neutral, and that's the overriding principle that governs all the rest of the litigation and all the rest of the principles of the First
Stop right
Amendment.
here, and I'm going to take a break, and then we'll come back to free speech. This is the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and our guest is attorney Lloyd Snook, and we're talking today about the incident on August the 11th and August the 12th in Charlottesville, Virginia. Okay,
Right.
I'll give it back to you
Okay.
on free speech.
So, as I was saying before we paused a second there, free speech is content neutral. What that means is if I'm a liberal, I get to speak freely. If I'm a conservative, I get to speak freely. If I'm really conservative, I still get to speak freely. Where we draw the line is on conduct. So I can say all kinds of hateful things. I can say that I want to kill all the Jews and send all the blacks back to Africa, which is what they were saying on August 12th.
Exactly.
But as long as I don't do anything, it's the doing of some. It's the actual threatening, physical violence. So, for example, one of the issues was when they were talking about killing the Jews. Well, the synagogue is just a block away.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody had taken a step towards the synagogue at that point, that somebody could have said, okay, now we've crossed the line between speech and action. Now you've gone too far. You're taking a physical step in that direction. And one of the discussions I've had with a lot of my friends about this, including some of my friends who were at the synagogue that day, is trying to to understand the distinction between and where the line gets drawn between hateful speech and inciting people to riot. So if, for example, one of the speakers had said, we should kill all the Jews and we should start right now by marching over to the synagogue, that would have been illegal.
Let's remind the audience that the participants themselves, call themselves Nazis and Ku Klux Klan, and have been using hate speech right along. Talking about killing Jews, as you were saying, about sending black folks back to Africa, and all kinds of hateful things. So these things came out of their mouths.
That's right. That's not us just making stuff up
Right.
about them.
Okay. And so that's why we're trying to say, and you gave an eloquent introduction, is that First Amendment is about speech and not conduct. So could you
That's
continue?
right. Well, and so the other thing that people have to understand, it's sort of a core principle of the First Amendment, is something that's called the public forum doctrine. And what that means is that when the state sets up a place where it's expected that people will historically people have used parks to give speeches, to have rallies, that when they do that, the government can't censor it. The government can't say, well, we'll let the liberals speak, but we won't let the conservatives speak. Or we'll let you be conservative, but just don't be too conservative. And so that's the problem when people say, how can the government how can the city let this happen? The answer is that the city doesn't have much choice. The city has to say, this is speech. As long as you don't cross the line to conduct, you're okay. Now, where I think most people in Charlottesville that I've talked to were really offended by what happened on August 12th. They were offended on 11th and 12th. They're offended by two things. They were offended by the fire, by the tiki torches and all the images of the torchlight parades and all of the danger that we associate with fire and torches and clans and burning crosses and all the rest of that stuff. And the second was the guns on the street. To see a militia group marching down Market Street with their assault rifles and their body armor and their helmets and shields and so on, looking like they're the National Guard, but they're not. The only way you could really tell for sure that they were not National Guard, they had a patch on the shirt that showed it had the American flag and the Confederate flag and some other emblem as well. And then you could say, okay, I know this is not the Virginia National Guard. But I just thought it was awful And most people I've talked to really thought that was sort of drawing the line of that's not just speech.
It's almost like 1920s all over again.
Right.
Ku
And
Klux Klan's marching down,
Yeah.
taking over a town,
And-
taking over the streets.
And that's the scary part. And people have a very legitimate reason to be scared about that. Now, there's one of the lawsuits that's going right now is a lawsuit that has been filed in the city of Charlottesville to say that militias that are not under the control of the governor cannot march. And that's something that's going to be
march.
fought about in the next few months.
Cannot march or carry arms.
Well, it can't be publicly mobilized because it's the intimidation that's the problem.
Okay, so how does this fit in with the special counsel that they have appointed?
Well, after all of this went down in August 11th and 12th, the city decided to appoint a special counsel, you want to call it, Tim Hafey, who is a Charlottesville resident. He was the U.S. attorney in Charlottesville for a long time, and he's an attorney who practices with a Richmond law firm. And he said, our law firm, if you want us to, will investigate, will prepare a report on what all happened. And so for a contract of, I think, $100,000, they were commissioned to go. And one of the things they're trying to do is to interview all of the people who will agree to talk to them and to collect the videos and to collect the various forms of documentation that may exist about police orders and that kind of thing, to try to reconstruct for everybody what happened and to develop a narrative of what happened that I think that they hope that people will trust.
Okay. Now, we talked about the preparation here in Charlottesville versus what has happened down in Gainesville, Florida, and Richmond, Virginia. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, the week or so after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, there was a rally down in Richmond around the monuments on Monument Avenue in Richmond. And about, again, 40 or so Klansmen showed up, and thousands of Richmonders showed up to be the anti-Klan rally. And because people, first of all, I have to say, the Klan rally in July was basically peaceful. There was some pushing and shoving, some tear gas got thrown that maybe didn't need to get thrown. That's a different issue for a different day.
Here in Charlottesville.
In Charlottesville.
Right.
But the July 8th incident was basically pretty peaceful. And so the Klan rally in Richmond was more like the Klan rally in Charlottesville. It wasn't ever intended to be the kind of Unite the Right kind of thing. Now, what happened, and it all went off pretty peacefully, and there were, as far as I can recall, no arrests or only maybe a couple of minor arrests. Then, just this past week, so that would be roughly, I guess, October 20th or so. Richard Spencer, one of the Unite the Right, one of the alt-right people, went down and gave a speech indoors at an auditorium in Gainesville, Florida. And again, thousands of people showed up, and they were protesting outside, and many of them were protesting inside. And they basically shouted him down as he was trying to give his speech. And of course, that's actually perfectly legitimate First Amendment theory, that the cure for bad speech is more speech.
But did they have the same rights to carry arms in both venues now?
That's a really important distinction, because in Gainesville, first of all, the incident was indoors. And so they could check everybody going in as they would come to make sure that there were no weapons there. Second, and because they were able to check for weapons, an awful lot of people who might have thought, gee, I'm going to bring my weapon to something like this, may have decided not to come. So it may have been sort of a self-selection as to who would come. But you get to a second point, which is that it relates to the right to open carry firearms, or right to concealed carry firearms. And in Virginia, we have a number of laws that have been passed in the last 10 or 15 years in particular that basically say the government can't restrict the ability of private citizens to carry firearms anytime, any place. And Virginia is one of the most free states in that sense, in terms of what restrictions there are, the fewest restrictions on carrying guns. There are cases that make pretty clear that if a city wants to set up as a condition of having a permit for a demonstration, they could say, but we're going to check your guns.
Okay.
I think that it's probably something, certainly as a constitutional matter, they could do. There's some thought that in Virginia maybe we can't do that because of the statutes, but there is not such a statute, for example, in Florida.
Okay. So running out of time, which I've enjoyed the discussion. Let's sum up to our audience, and what do you think we should be doing moving forward?
Well, moving forward, of course, over the next 6 months to a year, a lot of these, both the criminal cases and the civil cases, will be moving through the system. There will be a number of legislative changes that are being offered. One of the changes that we could do on a local level would be to rewrite some of the statutes and ordinances that deal with, for example, the use of fire. Should you be able to have tiki torches carried through the streets or carried around the grounds of the university or carried around generally, knowing the history of torches as weapons of intimidation, so to speak? You can't actually limit the use of them as intimidation, but you can say, fire is unsafe. We should regulate fire as a matter of public safety. There's some changes that could be, some tweaks that could be made to the Charlottesville ordinances on that. There's some state statute changes that need to get made. Some state statute changes that would, for one thing, authorize local governments to be able to restrict guns in times of crisis. Those are important kinds of things that ought to be worked on in the next 6 months to a year.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming and giving your views and talking to us about this important subject. And we learned a lot, the audience and myself. Just want to let the audience know this is the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris. Our guest has been Attorney Lloyd Snook, and our topic has been the incident. Remember, you can see the Neighborhood Law Center go to www.neighborhoodlawcenter.com. You can see this one will be coming up. And also, you can see it again on Channel 13 on Charlottesville Public Access TV at 10 p.m. Starting in November. So until next week, peace and God bless.